Hello, everyone, and many thanks for joining us today for the first Reservoir Town Hall. We plan to host these forums periodically to focus on issues that are important and relevant to the music industry. If you are new to us, Reservoir is an independent, publicly traded music company based in New York with extensive holdings in publishing as well as recorded music and management. Today, our guest is Chief Executive Officer and President of the National Music Publishers Association, David Israelite. Founded in 1917, the NMPA is the trade association representing all American music publishers and their songwriting partners. Its mission is to protect, to promote, and advance the interests of music creators and rights holders. The NMPA is the voice of both small and large music publishers and is the leading advocate for publishers and their songwriter partners in the nation's capital and in every area where publishers do business. So I'm sure you will agree that today's discussion is both timely and relevant. I have had the pleasure of working closely with David since 2015, when I was first elected for my term on the NMPA Board of Directors, witnessing his efforts and his resolve firsthand over the last 7 years. I can say without hesitation, the songwriting and publishing community could not have a stronger and a more effective champion leading the NMPA and the charge advocating for fair compensation for these stakeholders. Since his tenure began at the NMPA in 2005, David has secured over $1 billion in settlements benefiting publishing and creators. The NMPA's most recent victory came last month with the CRB, Copyright Royalty Board's decision to uphold increased mechanical streaming royalty rates for songwriters and music publishers retroactive to the beginning of 2018. In its July 2022 ruling, the CRB reaffirmed raising the minimum statutory mechanical streaming royalty rates incrementally from 10.5% to 15.1% over the years 2018 to 2022. Rejecting a lengthy appeal by several digital service providers. These are complicated issues and processes, and we expect that many of you have questions and would like to understand the nuances better. Please utilize the Q&A box to ask questions, and we will address them at the end. We look forward to hearing from you, but first, I want to turn it over to David to provide background on the CRB proceedings and explain how and why they are organized, along with sharing information and context around the board's most recent decision and speaking to what lies ahead. Welcome, David.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. Reservoir is a cutting edge and dynamic member of NMPA, one of the leading independent publishers in the world. And I know Golnar is a visionary, and so someone that I have a pleasure of working for and with. So it's a pleasure for me to be here. I've been asked to talk about the Copyright Royalty Board, which is timely and important. It's the most important income stream that songwriters and music publishers receive. It's about 1/3 of the industry's income. And it's timely because we are in the middle of the process that sets the rates, not only resolving looking backward 5 years, but in 12 days, we start a trial that will set the rates for the next 5 years. I think it's probably important to at least have some appreciation of the history of how we got here, since when you talk to most people outside the music industry and you tell them that 3 judges sitting in Washington, D.C. have a trial every 5 years, and they determine how much songwriters and music publishers get paid from the leading digital music services like Spotify, Apple, Amazon, Google, Pandora, they're confused. They ask, why is that the case? And the truth of the matter is there's not a really good reason to keep doing it this way, but it's the system that has developed over time that has been very difficult to change. And it started back in 1909, more than 100 years ago, when Congress thought that music publishers had a monopoly on the player piano roll industry. And so Congress passed a law that said that music publishers have to license their copyrights, and Congress set the price in law at 2 cents per copyright at that time. And after many years, about 60 years of nothing changing, Congress finally decided to set up a process by which that number could be adjusted over time. And when that happened, most of what mattered were products that were produced by record labels, and that music publishers were paid by those record labels, from things from vinyl to 8-tracks to cassettes and eventually CDs. And for 20 years, record labels and music publishers got together. They made deals on the prices, and we never went through a court proceeding to set prices. Ultimately, Congress changed the law one more time, creating this new body that we call the Copyright Royalty Board, or the CRB. It's comprised of 3 judges appointed by the Librarian of Congress. 1 judge has to be an economist, 1 has to be a copyright law expert, and the 3rd is a chief judge that has to have administrative law expertise. And this Copyright Royalty Board now is tasked with setting prices for 5-year terms. And so when we entered the very first Copyright Royalty Board, often referred to as Phono 1, Phono Records number 1, this was back in 2008. And at that time, we mostly still cared about what we were paid by record labels, not by this novel new idea of digital music streaming. And so we litigated against record labels in the very first CRB, and we settled with the then digital companies that were doing interactive streaming. Even though there was very little money in streaming, we came to an agreement over what they should pay us. And for 5 years, from 2008 to 2012, the agreement we made with these digital companies was the law. And when that first CRB term ended in 2012, we sat back down and decided to just extend what we had agreed to another 5 years. And so from 2013 to 2017, the same agreement that we entered into in the first Copyright Royalty Board was extended through the second Copyright Royalty Board. And that brings us to the year of 2017, the end of the second CRB period. At this time, the industry shifted. And what really was starting to matter more than the products that record labels produced was the interactive streaming services that were providing access models to consumers. And so when we approached the third CRB, we were not able to come to another agreement on what to do. And so for the very first time, we went to court and litigated the question against 5 digital companies that did interactive streaming: Apple, Amazon, Google, Spotify, and Pandora. We settled with record labels now that their product was declining in importance, and we went through an entire trial to determine rates. And we finally got a decision in January of 2018, and the decision was considered a major victory for songwriters and music publishers. The agreement that had been binding for the last 10 years was thrown out, and the court decided to give us a 44% increase in the amount of money that we would collect from these services. Now, they kept the structure of our prior 10-year agreement in place, which makes it a little more complicated than just a simple rate that they pay us. They pay us the greater of 3 different tests, and that came from the first 10 years of agreement. But what the court did in their 2018 decision was change the numbers in that 3-part test. The first part of the test is what most people think about when they think about the rate that we are paid by digital companies, and that is a percentage of revenue. The old agreement had them paying us 10.5% of their revenue. The new decision in 2018 increased that number to 15.1% of revenue, stepped up every year over the 5-year period, ending with the 15.1% number. The second prong of the 3-part test was meant to protect us, since we're not in the negotiating room deciding how these models will work. And it's often referred to as a TCC number, which stands for total content cost. The philosophy behind the TCC number is that record labels are in a free market. They are not covered by this 1909 law that makes them license their copyrights and has the prices set by a 3-judge panel. And so the TCC prong was designed to give us a percentage of whatever record labels got through their free market negotiations. And in that decision, the court gave us a big increase in the TCC. The third prong of the test was simply an amount of money they would have to pay us per subscriber, otherwise known as a PSM, or per subscriber minimum. And that was a number that was based just on what's known as the mechanical reproduction part of the equation. When you add in what they pay the PROs, or the performance rights organizations, you come up with a way to calculate that third prong. So a big victory for us in that decision. 4 of the 5 digital companies decided to appeal the decision to a federal court of appeals. And Apple was the only one that sat that out. And so we went through a long process from the decision point in January of 2018 all the way through August of 2020, where we were fighting over the appeal of that decision. In August of 2020, the Court of Appeals sent back the case to the Copyright Royalty Board in what's known as a remand, meaning that they sent it back for the court to deal with some issues that the Court of Appeals had in the original decision. When they did that in August of 2020, the digital services took the position that because the case had now been remanded and we did not have a final decision that was effective, that they would all revert back to 2017 and start paying us under the rate structure that existed before the original decision in the third trial. That meant that the higher rate that we should be getting, we were now getting paid under the old 10.5% of revenue rate, and that's what's been in effect since August of 2020. The court dealt with the issues that were sent back, and they finally came out with a decision that dealt with what was sent to them by the Court of Appeals. So we now have a decision from the Copyright Royalty Board dealing with the appeal. Most importantly, they preserved our 15.1% headline rate, that first prong in the formula, which means that since August of 2020 up until still today, the services are paying us under an old model when they're going to have to pay us under the original decision model of the higher rate structure. The court did make some changes in how the second prong works, and they also made a change in a particular type of product known as a bundle, where you take a music product, marry it with a non-music product, and then sell it to the consumer as a single package. But overall, we protected the big win. We are still going through the legal process of having now that appeal put into a final law. So here we sit in August of the last year of the 5-year term, and we are waiting for the CRB to issue what is known as a final determination. A final determination means they actually have written the decision that deals with the appeal, and they say, we are now done. That final determination could come out at any moment. It could happen while we're on this call. We expect it to happen very soon. When the final determination comes out, what technically happens then is the Register of Copyrights has a 60-day window to review it, and then they publish it in the Federal Register. When it is published, it is effective. It is done. And what happens then is that all of the digital services have to retroactively apply what is the rate structure, meaning that for several years, they've been underpaying us, but they will have to do what is called an accounting, which means they basically have 6 months to go back and make up any money that we were underpaid. Now, everybody is asking, how much money are we owed? And it's a very complicated formula because you have to go by every service, every offering, and do a month-by-month analysis of where they actually paid and where they should have paid. Our best analysis is that we are owed somewhere in the neighborhood of $600 to $700 million more than we've been paid. So there is a significant amount of money that is coming to us when that decision becomes final. However, because the services have 6 months to do it, we're looking at that money not being infused into the industry until probably mid next year. But the good news is that we protected most of the win from the original decision, and that money will be owed and paid sometime in 2023. Now, while that process was going on, because it dragged on for so long, we have started the process for the next 5-year period, which we call CRB4. CRB4 covers the time period of 2023 to 2027. And so to get a decision for the next 5 years, we have a trial that will start in 12 days on September 6th. So while we are still waiting for a final determination that goes back more than 4.5 years, we are going to be litigating the trial that sets the rate for the next 5 years. This has never happened before. It demonstrates a completely broken system that you're having overlapping periods of these Copyright Royalty Board decisions. But there's nothing we can do but live under the rules as they exist today. And so because of that, we're ready to start a trial in 12 days before we have final results of what the rates have been for more than 4.5 years. Now, it's the same 5 digital companies on the other side of the courtroom in CRB4 that were there in CRB3. So Apple, Amazon, Google, Spotify, and Pandora. On our side of the courtroom, NMPA represents the entire industry of songwriters and music publishers, along with the Nashville Songwriters Association that sits by our side as our partner. Now, all of the parties have been engaged in quite a bit of trial preparation, which means we've all filed what are known as written direct cases, which is our proposals to the court over what we want the rates to be for the next 5 years. We've taken a lot of discovery. We've had a lot of depositions. Both sides have witnesses that are ready to testify, expert economists, people from the industry. We're putting up many songwriters to be witnesses. All of that is basically going on right now, with depositions going on this week to prepare for the trial that starts in 12 days. Now, in any Copyright Royalty Board process, there is the option to try to settle it before you go to court. And we are engaged in a process right now where we are talking to the other side about a potential settlement. But until you have an agreement, until it's been filed, until the court accepts it, we have to prepare as if we are going to trial. There's a lot that's going on in this area that gives us tremendous optimism about the industry. I mentioned that this is the #1 revenue source for the industry, and that it represents about 1/3 of the total revenue of a very diversified industry of music publishing and songwriting. When we look at the future with regard to these companies, we pay attention to a lot of different things. But there are some factors that we are paying particular attention to that give us great optimism. First of all, many of you have followed the different announcements about public companies' growth or NMPA reporting on the industry's growth. We have gone through a period, even with COVID, where there has been significant progress in growth, despite the fact we have been getting paid for our most important revenue source under an outdated and anemic model when we are owed that money. So when you look at those past pronouncements about growth stories of the industry or particular companies, remember that is all happening before we're getting the benefit of the last decision and the 15.1% rate. The other thing that we track very closely, obviously, is the growth of these services themselves. We were involved in passing a law back in 2018 called the Music Modernization Act. And one of the things that that law did was create a new entity called the Mechanical Licensing Collective, or the MLC, that is now in place to accept the revenue that comes in from these services and distribute that revenue. What is revolutionary about the MLC is that it is the first place in the world where these types of royalties are being collected and distributed with no commission taken off the top. The traditional way that our industry has worked is that you collect the revenue and then we have to pay for the administration of that revenue, meaning we lose anywhere from 10 to 20% of that revenue just to administer processing those royalties. The MLC is funded 100% by the digital companies that benefit from it, which means that for every dollar collected from these digital services, we distribute the full dollar to the industry. So when you combine the higher rate that we're owed with no commission, that was something that was a new factor that started last year, you are looking at a situation where we are going to be enjoying the highest rates in the history of digital music in the world. Then you look at the growth of the industry itself. The MLC collects a lot of data. We unveiled some of that at the NMPA annual meeting back in June, which anyone who didn't catch that is welcome to go back on our website and look at all of that information. But one thing that I want to point out is that we are tracking the first quarter of 22 compared to the first quarter of 21. And what we are already seeing is significant growth in the number of subscribers that are paying for music subscriptions and the amount of revenue that is coming into these services. So when people track subscriber numbers, oftentimes they are handcuffed by looking only at individual companies, and some of those companies only unveil those statistics when it serves their purposes. We now have perfect information about the number of paying subscribers because they have to tell the MLC every month what they're doing. And we have seen a 10% growth first quarter over first quarter and a 13% growth of revenue first quarter over first quarter from 21 to 22, which means when we are looking at our modeling of where this is going, combined with the higher rates and with the no commission, it is a very optimistic future for music publishing and songwriting, especially given this is our most important revenue source. So that gives you a little bit of the background of how we got to where we are, where we sit in the process. There's a lot going on. This story could be different by tomorrow. But I think what's most important to take out of this is that we feel like we are basically done with the appeal of the last decision and are going to be waiting on the infusion of that 600 to 700 million. We are starting a new trial soon unless we settle, and we feel very strong about how the outcome of that trial will be, which is why we're so optimistic about the industry. And so with that, maybe is a good time for me to pause, and I'm happy to address anything that you'd like to ask about, whether it's about the CRB or anything else about the industry. And again, thank you so much, Golnar, for allowing me to be a guest. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you, David. And thanks to everyone who has submitted questions. We are going to start to go through that queue. So the first question is around the impact of the CRB ruling on investments in music catalogs. And songs are already being recognized as steady financial opportunities. What is your view on how the raised rates impact the value of the catalogs? I think you've touched on this a bit.
I think there are a lot of factors that go into valuing catalogs, obviously. But what I would suggest is that this issue may be the number one factor that justifies the prices that are being paid for songs. I think that when you talk about the most important income stream, with rates going up in an area where there is also growth, it is a reason to feel very confident about investments in music catalogs. And so there are a lot of factors that involve interest rates and bond payments and scarcity. But I think of all those factors, looking at the revenue flow that is a very steady, almost guaranteed amount on a growth trajectory is one of the most, if not the most important factor when it comes to valuing catalogs today.
Okay, thank you. The next question is somebody asking for some further explanation on the change in the second prong of the CRB decision.
Sure. So this gets a little complicated, but I'll try to explain it in a way that makes it understood. And if not, let me know and I'll try again. So I mentioned that the second prong of the three-prong test is looking at how much record labels get paid as an alternate way for us to get paid. When we did the original settlement, the second prong was an either or number. It was a set number per subscriber or an amount that the label got paid. It was the lesser of those two numbers. When the original decision came out from the court just said, we're just going to give you the single factor of how much the labels get paid with no alternate number and a lesser of formula. That was the one thing that we really lost in the appeal, is it went back to this formula of lesser of. And the truth of the matter is, we care about this because we want to just be tied to the label's negotiating leverage in a free market. But here's what's most significant about that second prong. If our headline rate is above 13%, that second prong has largely been irrelevant. It was only really a factor if our headline rate was 10.5%. So when we won the headline rate increase, the fact that the second prong reverted back to this lesser of number, 80 cents per subscriber or a percentage of what labels get, the financial impact is irrelevant. Now, I'm talking about the most important category under Section 115, which is what most people think about, the standalone portable subscription, where you pay around $10 a month, you get the full service. There are other models where that second prong does not have that factor. The biggest one is the Spotify free service, ad supported. For that model, we just get the percentage of the label revenue as an alternate without this lesser of formula. But for the most important category, we're back to the original formulation of it. But again, it doesn't matter if our headline rate is at 15.1, because that by far is the one that's going to win out the test of the three prongs, which means we may have lost that battle, but we didn't lose the war. The war was about the headline rate, and that's the one that we won.
Well, it's certainly complicated, and I think that clarifies things a little bit. Another question that has come in is around choice and election of publishers to actually withdraw from the process, and you touched a little bit on how the process that we have to live within, the rules that are imposed, and that's how we have to operate. But is there an option for essentially stakeholders to withdraw from that process?
Right. So to be clear, I despise compulsory licenses. I think they're unfair. I think they're unjustified. I think they're based on flawed historical analysis that is no longer relevant today. Just think of it from the standpoint that what the antitrust laws are being used to do is protect Amazon, Apple, and Google against songwriters. That's the effect of a compulsory license for this type of stuff. So we have been working for any way that we can escape this process and actually be in a free market like record labels are, where we get to negotiate the value of our property. And if we don't like the price they're paying, we can say no. Now, the justification for putting this on publishers is that songs often have many owners, unlike sound recordings. With a sound recording, a record label, generally you have one place to go to get the whole copyright of what they have. But for music publishers and songwriters, because the nature of songwriting is collaborative, you often have multiple owners of a single song. And so the argument that the Apples and Amazon and Googles make is it's too hard for us to go out and negotiate with every fractional owner of every song. We need this type of compulsory license. When it comes to Section 115 of the Copyright Act, there is no escape from the compulsory license. They can extract your property rights without your permission. All they have to do is pay you what this court says is the going rate. So we have been looking for other ways to try to gain that leverage. So for example, video rights are not included. Lyric rights are not included. Internationally, other countries do not have this compulsory license. So when you're negotiating for a worldwide service that wants to have bells and whistles involving video or lyrics, there are some leverage points that publishers have, But in the United States, when it comes to the basic right to include these songs in these services, we have no rights. We cannot pull out, we cannot withdraw, we cannot say no. We can only participate in the process every 5 years to fight for what the rate will be. And that is a law that I would love to change. Maybe someday we'll be successful at that. But to date, we've been unable to get out of that type of a system.
Understood. The next question is around fairness, in that what is fair compensation? And I do recall that years ago, we talked a lot about the objective being parity, essentially, as far as how songwriters are getting paid vis-a-vis artists. How do you think about fairness today, as far as fair royalty rates go, and in the context of songwriters vis-a-vis artists? And would you say that we still have the same objective in front of us?
Sure. So this is the topic where I will upset a lot of people, and that's okay because I've done it before. And I will also preface what I'm about to say with what I think is fair is irrelevant. It's not my property. My opinion about its value doesn't matter. What I think matters are markets. Markets will value property properly if it is a free, fair market. So I'd be willing to put the publishing copyright in a free market next to the record label copyright, and whatever the market produces, I'll accept that as the fair value because the market will have decided. But that's not the system we have. We have a system where one of the copyrights is in a free market and can say no, and the other copyright is controlled by this government price control and compulsory license. Now, the history of the music industry is so interesting because so much of what happens today is based on the historical anomalies of how we got here. When it comes to this type of product, which record labels would call a mechanical, you go back to the earlier iterations of it, which would have been the physical products that you used to buy. Start with vinyl. The vinyl money was split about $10 to $12 to a record label for every $1 to a music publisher and songwriter. Then we advanced to the digital download era, where Apple mostly sold permanent digital downloads at a 99-cent price point or up to a $1.30 price point. In that world, it was about a 9-to-1 ratio of record label to publisher. So when streaming came about, it was replacing those old models. So record labels naturally felt that the ratios from the previous models should import to the new model and that they should still be getting the same type of split, 12, 10, 9 to 1 against music publishers. And for the first iteration of streaming, it was about a 5-to-1 ratio. The labels were getting about 52% of the revenue. We were getting the 10.5% of the revenue. And a lot of people thought, this is great. It's much better than it used to be when we had physical product or permanent digital downloads. When the ruling came out in 2018, that gap all of a sudden narrowed to about 3.8 to 1, which was historically the best ratio we've ever had. And again, a lot of people thought this is a high watermark. We should be happy. We're getting about a 4-to-1 ratio. That's not how I look at it. I look at the other area of the music industry that is called synchronization. Synchronization means simply that you marry video to music. It is the only area in the music industry where both record labels and music publishers are in a free market. There's no government regulation. There's no consent decrees from the Justice Department. It is two parties negotiating their copyrights. And in the synchronization market, the money is split 50-50. If you are a movie or a TV show or a commercial, and you want to put a song into that sync, and you have to negotiate with the record label the same way you have to negotiate with the music publisher gets the same amount of money as the record label. So from where I sit, a free market produces a decision that the value between the two copyrights is the same. Now, can you ever get the historical track record of a 12-to-1 split to a 9-to-1 split to a 5-to-1 split to a 3.8-to-1 split to ever be a 1-to-1 split? Really, really hard to do. And the other thing that is just true is that a record label dollar is more valuable to a corporation than a publishing dollar. And the reason why is because publishers share more of the money with songwriters than record labels do with artists. So if you are a corporation that has both a record label and a music publisher, your financial preference will be a label dollar over a publishing dollar. So I don't think we're ever going to reach parity in the interactive streaming world, but I think that more and more of these business models are actually synchronizations. So you look at where a lot of the growth is in the industry, things like YouTube, TikTok, even Peloton, those are syncs. That's where we should be protecting this idea that a free market produces equal value. So 3.8 to 1, better than it's ever been. My personal opinion is that's not the right split. But again, I don't get to make that decision. If we could ever get into a free market, we would know the answer. And I think the answer would be a lot closer to parity than it is 3.8 or 4 to 1.
The next question is around the PROs, the US-based PROs, and how they fit into this entire equation, ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC. And there doesn't really seem to be much traffic, and they're not involved in the conversation. So if you could talk a little bit about why that is, that would be helpful.
Sure. And if you thought the previous topics were complicated, we'll get into the PROs. So our public performance right is not regulated by law. Our mechanical reproduction right is. That's the Section 115 decision that was based on a 1909 law. But our public performance is not regulated by law, just like our synchronization is not regulated by law, just like our lyrics in grand rights, not regulated by law. However, in 1941, Congress thought that the two companies that had the dominant market share of administering public performance were monopolies. And they put them under consent decrees in 1941. And what the consent decrees basically say is that if you are a member of ASCAP or BMI, which together represent somewhere around 90% of the public performance market, that you are acting like it is a compulsory license. You can't say no. And if you can't agree on a price, you go to a federal judge in the Southern District of New York, and that judge will set the price. Now, digital streaming companies are part mechanical, part performance. They implicate both types of our copyrights. And most people look at that and think, well, why do you care? It's the same song, the same copyright. It goes to the same people. But it makes a big difference how that money is administered. And so when you are an Apple or Amazon or Spotify, you are paying partly through this MLC that is the mechanical and partly through the PROs that are the performance rights. The way that the formula works is that what you pay the PROs, you get to treat like a deduction on your tax returns. So for example, if you owe 15.1% of your revenue under the law, but you've paid the PROs 5% of your revenue, then what you do is you go to the MLC and say, I owe you 15%, I've paid the PROs 5%, so here's the 10% that I still owe. That's how the process works. And so the PROs are not part of this trial or this rate setting, but whatever they're getting, people get to deduct from the total that they owe us. Now, if you think that I hate compulsory licenses on mechanicals, I hate consent decrees on PROs even more, because the public performance right was never regulated by law. It was because the Justice Department thought these private companies had too much market power against the fledgling broadcast industry in 1941. Today, same companies, Google, Apple, Amazon, protected by the Justice Department's consent decrees against ASCAP and BMI. Now, there's a lot changing in that world. You have other PROs that are not regulated, CSAC and GMR, together somewhere around 10 to 15% of the market. There may be more that are coming, but that is probably we're going to be where you see more change in the industry on the public performance side than you do on the mechanical side, where you would need an act of Congress to change the law.
Thank you. Next question is around the inputs that define the sort of sound visual bundle. If you could talk a little bit about what rights are included there and what rights are not, and provide a little bit of clarity on that.
Sure. So every individual model is different, and you have to start by defining what it is. And this is a really silly exercise, right? Music publishers and songwriters have a copyright. If someone wants to use their copyright, the way this should work, you should go to the owner, you should negotiate a deal, and then you should get to use the copyright under the terms of that deal. But because the type of exploitation matters so much, if it's a mechanical, the price is set by law in this 3-judge panel. If it's a performance, it's set mostly through a consent decree in a federal judge. If it's something else, it's in a free market. That for every different type of application of music, you have to start by defining what it is. And then you can start to get your head around how the prices work. And what makes it even more confusing is that record labels have different rules. And so oftentimes people get very confused because the way that the songwriter and publisher have their price set is completely unrelated to how a record label and artist have their price set. So many times what a service wants to do is some blend of those rights. They want a mechanical, but they want to add a video feature or a lyric feature, or it's a public performance and a video feature. And the way that it works in practice is that you have to separate the different parts of what it is, and the prices are negotiated differently. So let me give you an example. YouTube, the largest music service on the planet. YouTube implicates public performance. So they have to go to the PROs, ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, and GMR, and they have to get a performance license from the PROs, and they have to pay the PROs money. But yet at the same time, YouTube is a synchronization. They have video that has music married to it. And for that, they have to go to the publishers and negotiate a license for the synchronization. So what YouTube does is mostly economically a synchronization. Most of the money gets paid to publishers directly. But there's a part of it that is also public performance, and they pay a much smaller part to the PROs that again then distribute the money to that same publisher. So for any individual model, you can look at the economics and what it primarily is, but that just gives you the framework of how you answer the question when it blends the different categories together. How is it priced? How do we get paid? And you just have to start by drawing bright lines between mechanical reproductions governed by law, public performances governed by consent decrees, and then everything else. And then it all starts to make sense.
Unrelated to rates, unrelated to sort of bundling definitions, and it's a question that is particularly relevant to our business and many publishers, is your view on whether there's any potential for simplification of the sample clearance process for creators?
Yeah, it's a great question, because there is a tension between the ease of licensing our copyrights and the value of our copyrights. So if you're doing whatever is the easiest so that people can use the music, so you can use it how you want in an easy fashion, you would move toward the system of a blanket license for all music, a price set by a third party. You get it all in one transaction. That makes it easy. If you're concerned mostly with the value of the copyrights, you never want to do that, because different songs may have different values, or different owners may have different views about what they're willing to do for a certain price. So there is always a tension between ease of licensing, value of copyright. What music publishers, and especially companies like Reservoir, have been really good at is figuring out how to make licensing easier without sacrificing the value. And that is not an easy thing to do, to thread that needle. So coming up with, I would call them sometimes unique, but sometimes just clever solutions, has been where music publishers have really become different types of companies than they were in the past. In the past, it was just hard. Now, music publishers have become very good at making this work as long as you're willing to actually go through the process. Some people like to steal music or just use it without permission, and we go after those people. But if you want to use music in a novel way or a way that's different or something that takes like a small piece of music and puts it in a bigger thing, you can do that today fairly easily because music publishers have become so good at licensing those types of models. And so samples are a little bit different. You know, a sample is where you take one song, you embed it in your own song, and then put it out. You need permission for that. And there's no way around going to the original song owner and agreeing to terms and getting permission. What happens all the time is you ask for forgiveness and not permission. You do it, you get caught, and then you have to go back and try to clean it up. The sample situation, though, is not hard. You go to the song owner and you work it out. What's more complicated is when you want to do it on a mass scale. So you want some type of application where you have pieces of songs in a very widespread application. And if you look at a lot of the deals that have been done by music publishers lately, you can see that that's been happening fairly regularly. So for example, social media. There was a time when no social media company licensed their music. Today, you have licenses with Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and TikTok and Triller, not yet Twitter, but soon. Look at other companies that are doing novel things like Roblox or what Peloton did. They all can license if they just engage. And so I think that the lesson that publishers learned a long time ago is that this is no longer a simple world of sell records or be on radio or put a single song in a movie or TV show. This is a world where there are ways to make money off your music with novel and different ideas of how to exploit it. And the publishing industry has been very willing to engage on that. And I think the explosion of these types of applications proves that it can be done.
Yes, it does. And it's pretty unbelievable to think that here we are now licensed to platforms like Peloton, et cetera, you know, in categories like in-home fitness that we didn't even anticipate were going to be categories of revenue for us, say, 5 years ago.
And looking ahead at things like the Web3 applications of virtual reality or the metaverse or even NFTs that we're engaged in, another great example. Tremendous opportunity for music publishers to license these new applications. If you think about it, virtual reality, the entire universe of what will be virtual reality is a synchronization.
Pivoting a little bit, are there international implications to both how CRB3 will conclude and how CRB4 will conclude? Does this sort of leak into how other countries compensate songwriters, publishers, etc.?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer, I think, is yes. So when you look at the rest of the world, you kind of look at developed music markets that have their own independent ways to set prices. And then you have what we would call developing countries where those markets are still being established and the rules might be a little bit different. Even though there is no direct link between the rates in the United States and the rates in other mature music markets like Europe or Japan, Canada, the truth is that most people look at the United States as the benchmark, and that sets the precedent for the rest of the world. And so we do think that the result of the CRB3 appeal and now the upcoming CRB4 will have a worldwide impact. And that's a good thing when the rates in the United States go higher, which they have been doing. The challenge in that is that when you're talking about trying to settle what the rates will be, you end up in a discussion that's not just about the United States, because the companies look at whatever they agree to here as maybe precedential around the world. And that certainly complicates any types of settlement discussions for just the United States. But I think the evidence is yes, that the United States is a benchmark for the rest of the world. If our rates go up, there's a good argument that the rest of the world rates will go up. And if our rates go down, you can expect there will be challenges in other countries to reduce those rates as well.
Thank you. We spoke a little bit again about living within the confines of the rules that are set, and we have to obviously behave within those parameters and follow the legal procedures within those parameters. is there, obviously there's hope, but is there any anticipation that might be a new process in place at some point? And do you think it's effective to sort of continue to review, especially as technology changes and as more and more the compensation models become obsolete?
Yeah. So we have multiple goals as a trade association representing great companies like Reservoir. One of the goals is to not let any more regulation be put on our industry. And believe me, there are lots of people that would love the entire music publishing industry to work like it does with the CRB and the mechanical rate setting, where there's never a negotiation. There's always a government agency telling us the price and saying that we have to license our copyrights. So one effort is to stop any further regulation. Second effort is to try to get out of the regulation that we now have, and that's divided into two main categories: the compulsory license for mechanicals and the consent decrees for public performance. On the mechanical side, there is likely going to be a very healthy conversation about reforming the process to work better, but there's probably not going to be any agreement about eliminating the process. And so I suspect there'll be an effort to amend the way that the CRB works, but it would be next to impossible to eliminate the CRB through legislation in Congress. But on the public performance side, where we are not regulated by law, and this is a function of a Justice Department consent decree from 1941, I think there's more opportunity to change the way that it works. First of all, the Justice Department decided in 1979 that every new consent decree should sunset within 10 years because it is bad public policy for the government to regulate industries through consent decrees. Well, they didn't apply that retroactively, which means these 1941 consent decrees never end. We have been fighting to try to get the Justice Department to take a look at changing or eliminating those consent decrees. We made some progress in terms of the conversations under the Trump administration, but no changes there yet. The other thing that is true is that because we are not regulated by law, there are opportunities to license public performance outside of ASCAP and BMI. So you have seen other PROs start, like the newest one, GMR, that is not regulated at all. You have had a lot of discussion, I'm sure, within individual publishing companies about maybe we should license our own public performances. We don't need to go through an ASCAP or BMI if the system's not working well. But the other thing that's true is that when we passed the Music Modernization Act in 2018, we changed the way that the prices are set for ASCAP and BMI, and we are still waiting for the first test case to see whether or not it's going to work better. Right now, BMI has two active litigations under the new rules. ASCAP has one, and we will see whether or not the changes in the law from 2018 actually make it so that they're empowered to produce better rates through the new process. But I think there could be changes in how public performances are licensed. I think that's likely. With mechanicals, I think there could be tinkering over the process, but not probably an elimination of the compulsory license. The good news for publishers, however, the fastest growing segment of the industry is synchronization. And that happens to be the area where we're in a free market. So with all these types of services that Golnar just mentioned, their synchronization-based models, they are launching into an area where they have to negotiate with music publishers, not go to a court to get a price set. So when you look at what does the future hold, and we're pretty bad as an industry of predicting what consumers are going to want in the future. But if you look at most of the new stuff that has come around, as Golnar mentioned, in-home fitness, social media, video games, all of that is in the area where we're not regulated, which means that if you're projecting out the future of the industry, in addition to the benefits that we've gotten from successes in the areas where we're regulated, most of the growth is coming in an area where we're not regulated at all.
Understood, and thank you. We have about 5 minutes left, so I will do a couple of more questions. We touched a little bit earlier on the value of a dollar coming into a record label versus the value of a dollar coming in to the publisher, and it was in the context of parity of the rates. What do you say to the DSP argument that any increase in the publisher's royalty rates should actually be coming from the labels?
Yeah, they make that argument a lot. You hear other people make that argument, and I think it's completely bogus. If you're a DSP, you've decided to go into the business of taking someone else's product and delivering it to a consumer. And that's your value proposition, is that someone else makes it, you take it, deliver it, and you want a piece of the financial transaction. You have a lot of different costs involved in that. You've got to pay the record label for their copyright. You've got to pay the music publisher for their copyright. You got to pay your rent. You got to pay your employees. You got to pay for your marketing, all of that. It's all in competition over where any dollar goes. Record labels are in a free market, so they negotiate the value of what they have, and if the services think it's too high, then they don't have to be in that business. We should be in the same place. But to compare what we produce as somehow being on a give and take with what they produce, and to ignore all the other cost factors, I think ignores the fact that songs are an independent copyright. There's no reason why the services can't pay more. It doesn't have to come out of a label share. Now, if it does, that's the market reacting. We have nothing to do with that. All we can do is try to get a fair price for our product. And so I completely reject the idea that somehow it's our responsibility to get someone else to take less so they can pay us more. I mean, the same would be true. Why don't we go to their landlord and try to reduce their rent? Why don't we go to their employees and ask them to take pay cuts? I mean, they're all in competition for the revenue that comes into that company. And the fact that just because you've got publishers and labels that are both in the music industry doesn't mean that our individual property rights are in competition with each other directly.
Got it. Thank you. I'm sorry that we're not going to be able to get to all the questions, but I am going to wrap this up now. And I really appreciate you joining us today, David. I know it's a very, very busy time. And we're really appreciative of your insight and grateful, very grateful for your continued championing of songwriters, publishers, and all rights holders. I hope that for the guests and everybody who has joined us, you have found this town hall clarifying and informative. I can give you David's cell phone number if you would like to contact him directly. I won't do that, David. And we look forward to continuing to address pertinent music industry issues in future sessions. And again, David, thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. And honestly, if there are questions that I wasn't able to get to, if you want to have them sent to me, I'd be happy to try to respond with answers to make sure that everyone in this room here gets their questions answered.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.